Welcome to the Elevating Funeral Service podcast. If you want to run a successful funeral home, cemetery, or pet cremation service, you don't have to be the one that has the lowest price. You do need to be the one that offers the most value, provides the best customer experience, and clearly communicates that in your marketing. On this weekly podcast, Ellery and Welton will show easy ways to demonstrate value to families and create differentiation that helps you stand out from the competition. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Elevating Funeral Service podcast. I'm your host, Ellery Bowker. I'm with my good friend and co-host, Welton Hong. And tonight we're lucky enough to have Jake Johnson with Johnson Consulting with us. And we've got a really great episode. We're going to be talking about how to make your funeral home more valuable if you ever should decide to sell it. So, Jake, thank you for joining us tonight. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think the majority of the funeral world knows you, but for those that don't, would you mind kind of telling us who you are and what Johnson Consulting does?
So Jake Johnson, Johnson Consulting Group. We've been around since the late 90s, but I came on board in 2004 and primary focus being in mergers and acquisitions for the funeral space. So all things funeral businesses, helping people buy, sell, succession planning, valuations, and then we also offer back office support and accounting, business consulting, and a technology firm. And then I own a funeral home as well. So a little bit of everything, but primarily on business valuation and helping people maximize their value and be successful as they move forward.
Awesome. And Welton, you're doing good?
Oh yeah, just things are starting to open up here in Vegas. So I'll be hitting restaurants. It's been fun.
Awesome.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. Well, for the listeners, what we try to do on this podcast every week is we try to come and talk about one subject and take a deep dive on it that hopefully you as funeral home owners and cemeterians can have some actionable takeaways. And so today we've got a really good episode. What we're going to be talking about, like I said, is how to increase the value of your funeral home. So to kind of set the stage, I think if you're a funeral home owner pretty much anywhere in America and you're approached by an acquirer or you decide that you want to sell your funeral home, there can often be a disconnect between what you feel the funeral home is worth and what the acquirer feels as a fair market value. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody.
Nope.
So what I thought we might do is have Jake on here, who's got arguably a ton of experience in this area. And so he's going to be able to lend a lot of knowledge to this. What I want to do today is talk about specifically what the acquirers look at. So if you're a funeral home owner, should you ever decide to sell, what are they looking for? And I think by having that knowledge, it can help you kind of maybe position things a little bit differently in your business or maybe start to tighten things up. But it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So, Jake, I wanted to talk about one thing first, because I know this happens. And the first kind of big question, because this probably could be funny in some instances and maybe sad in others, but what are the funeral home owners most surprised at when they start down the path of an acquisition? So they're approached or they approach somebody and they get this dating started. What are the funeral home owners most surprised at?
I think that there's a couple things that there's certainly looking at financial information, case counts, things of that nature. But, there's a deep respect by the buyer for who is in the payroll, what those people are going to be doing going forward, what's the succession on that payroll look like. So when this seller slows down, who's going to run it? And so I think there's a lot of attention to the staffing part, but I would say one of the surprises most people get is they feel like, okay, they're preparing to sell. And so they feel like I got to get all my personal expenses in there because I'm the only small business owner in the United States that has personal expenses in my funeral home and I don't want to get caught. And the fact of the matter is they're in there. People know that, they respect that, they can appreciate it. It just has to be well documented and so that they can make the appropriate adjustments. So I think they're kind of surprised by the fact that you can just enter into the process with your personal expenses in there and maybe not have maybe there's assets that need some improvements, what have you, but buyers are still interested. It's all about assessing that risk and what the opportunity is. And that opportunity can play a big part. Certainly you hope that it trumps any risk and that's what creates good value. So yeah, I think those are some surprises.
So you're saying that they're surprised that the buyer would still be interested, even though they had personal expenses mixed in with their business expenses?
Yeah, I think they would say, I'll take my business. if the way I run my business, and I don't take much out of it, but the fact is, at the end of the day, after paying debts, there's not much left over, and that's intended that way.
Sure.
I'm a small business, and I'm trying to minimize taxes. I'm not avoiding them,
Right.
but I'm doing what I should do prudently. And so I think buyers would be surprised or sellers would be surprised when they go to sell. They know that their business is worth X, or they have an idea of what that range may be, more is what it is. But they're not sure how you get there, because they know at the end of the day, there's not much money left for them. They've run either the personal expenses, or they just run it differently, and they're not. There's the notion of the outsourcing of accounting, and those different types of functions that when these buyers come in, if they're bigger buyers, that is, on these bigger deals, it's amazing the profile of EBITDA difference. It can be a difference of thinking that you make net 200,000 and them thinking you make 500,000. It's often why you hear a seller say, "I got 8 times for my business," 8 times multiple. And the fact of the matter is, but buyer came in, had efficiencies, and their EBITDA was higher, and so the multiple was probably the 5.5 to 6 times. So.
Right. Yeah, they don't understand the add backs and all of the other stuff that they can
Yep.
do. Yeah. I know the same thing here. I mean, my goal at the end of the year is to make 0. I mean, I don't
Right.
even want to make any money. Now we're optimizing for growth and not for selling. So if we were trying to sell it, we'd be doing things a lot differently. Yeah. So.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing with that is how can what are the appropriate add backs? So if we know that's acceptable, what are those benchmarks that says, okay, this is a believable result, and so I can narrow in on value, and that's the important thing where you find that outside expertise for.
Yeah. Would you say that the majority of acquisition talks, the seller is surprised that there's a disconnect on the value, or do you think that most of the time there is a disconnect?
I think so. I mean, there's the hopes and dreams and the realities, and so, quite frankly, it happens both ways. I mean, I've had sellers that if they got I'll make up numbers. Let's say they thought their business was worth 10 million, and they thought that was a stretch. And we market the business, and all of a sudden they get 14 million. I mean, we've had businesses where the difference was 5 million from what they thought they would get, on larger deals, and not uncommon that it's 500,000 to $1 million. And so it's really that and how it's presented, and for them to know, if you're going to bring me a business and say you're worth 5 million, but your EBITDA is 50% of revenues, well, I don't believe it, and I don't think it's sustainable. If you say your EBITDA is 20%, and you want 5 million, well, you might not be asking for enough, or maybe it is 20% and there's a problem. So it's kind of like it's all these factors you're looking at.
Yeah. Just a quick aside, with the acquisitions that are taking place now, is it still going to be predominantly family?
That's acquiring?
Right. Or employees versus corporations?
You'd like to think so. I mean, really, it honestly, it's for anybody. I mean, the biggest joy is you could sell to those people that put all that hard work in, and employees and staff. The problem becomes in the financing that they can get that's available, and there needs to be more of that in our space. That on the larger deals, there's good, there's the SBA products. We know that out there. We got those banks that do that, but the cash flow based side of things. Cash flow based financing that used to be around in our business back in the 90s or maybe even early 2000s. Well, definitely early 2000s. Definitely helped people buy more than one. When I bought my business, SBA has a max I think at 5 million right now, and so if your hopes and dreams were just to buy one funeral home or maybe 2, that's going to work out for you probably. But if you're trying to buy a whole bunch, you're going to, I'm hearing rumblings that SBA might increase that maximum threshold per borrower, but there's some limitations to it for sure. So.
Yeah, interesting. So let's kind of get into the meat and potatoes here. So I own a funeral home. I'm not intending to sell it, right? But somebody may come along and buy it. I'm going to age. Maybe I don't have any staff that wants it or no children that are interested in entering the business. And I want to know now, what do acquirers look for? So if I wanted to maybe position my business, we'll talk about some specific things I could do as a funeral home owner, but why don't we talk more of specifically what they look for? So let's say that you have a pile of money and you want to go out and you want to buy a funeral home. What are you looking for as an acquirer?
Right. So the first thing is, can I get a good as deep as I can assessment on what the risks are. So I'm first looking at the risks, but then while after I've done that, or during the time I'm doing that, what are the opportunities that reside? And it's kind of like this this curve that goes up, and these crossing points that at some point the risk becomes too much more than the opportunity, and it's just, you know, you realize, okay, so there's more effort for the reward, and so I'm going to either pay a little less, or I'm going to be less interested in, or I'm just not going to buy it. But it's where you find where there's a lot of upside opportunity, and the risk is minimal. And when I say risk minimal, you know, one notion could be from a marketplace assessment that you're a funeral home that has no competition. Well, as I see it, that's risk. Somebody's going to enter that market. So it's more that I see minimal risk because you're a great funeral home and you compete well against a good competitor, you know, and you have a good position. And it's more your franchise name in that market that, you know, everybody knows you, but the fact is you deliver good service and they come to you for multiple other reasons as well. So, I mean, that's just a quick start of what they're looking for, but certainly a risk versus reward, you know, risk versus opportunity, and then effort versus reward for sure. And so they're looking for clean financials. They're looking for good, either redundancy, if you will, within the payroll, if that's possible, but certainly that there's been some attention to succession planning, and that you're not selling a business that when you retire, so is half your staff, because they're all at retirement age, you know, that You've got a good payroll mix, if you will.
So one quick question.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Well, go ahead.
A question along the lines of that is, do buyers these days, do they look at, for example, their online reputation, their branding, how well they're branded, things like that? I know those aren't tied to any financials, but are people starting to look into those soft?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's you know, when you look into a market, I mean, we do it for our own funeral home. How many reviews do we have? What are our customers saying about us from the survey results we get back? What are some of those metrics that, rather than the owner telling me how they're succeeding, that the market can tell me how they're succeeding and delivering what they do? So yeah, I think it's an important, certainly important due diligence item, but also helps from that risk mitigation, or that opportunity that exists, knowing that they're a good brand in the market.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. A great question. Jake, talk about what some of the risks are. So obviously risk assessment is huge. It's your money, right? You don't want to lose it.
Right.
You're looking at a funeral home. I know you mentioned one risk is that they don't have a competitor, right? Because somebody can come in there and
right. Could be
quickly.
Right.
What are some of the other risks?
Yeah. So, and I mentioned about staff. So we had one business we sold where the business had really handed over the reins to their key manager, who's a very effective manager, very good. I mean, we worked with this manager to even do the valuation, but at the end of the day, you know, he was the guy that really was running the place. And so when it came to valuation, it really impacted the value of the business. And so how are you as an owner balancing that redundancy? So if you get hit by a bus, but not giving too much away where it's impacting your own value. So, and the staff there behind that person and what their roles are. And, you know, I have examples I certainly expand on of, you know, average sale and how that impacts value. But I mean, it's certainly a good start as we look at that. But I think about the question being what are people looking for that creates the value, or frame that question again for me. I went down the road in the payroll.
Yeah, what some of the risks are.
The risks, right? So certainly, as you mentioned, the competition. I talked about the staff. So the other risks would be what I call client specificity within the business. But is it a strictly Jewish faith service business? Is it strictly African American business? Is it non-denominational and serving all? Those businesses have different risks associated with the person's name or ties to the religious community, or, you know, the ethnicity in the market. And there are things to be considered, and they affect value, quite frankly. I think other risks include the path, what I call the path of progress in the market. as the city's growing, are you growing with the city? Are you stuck in this one place and not expanding beyond that? And so, I've seen, we have had fantastic businesses that we've marketed in the past that if we had sold them maybe 5 years before they came to us, there was some runway for that buyer to take over what was a great business and with the more energy expand into a new market, as opposed to they came to us 5 years later and now we're selling a business where that path of progress is left. And so now buyers not only got to come in and try to resurrect and secure what's going on there, but knows that they still have to expand into the other market. So path of progress is always a big one for me. I think thinking about the mix of the business, but more so, a lot of value is driven from the trend that's going on in the business. And it starts with the revenue trend, of course. I mean, if nothing else, is the business consistently doing, let's say like my business, $1.4 million, $1.5 million, $1.3 million, $1.4 million? Is it staying in that range, or is it this downward trend, or is it an upward trend? And then you can dig into that deeper on what's their case mix look like and who do they service. So if you don't have a good trend, why don't you have the good trend, and how can you mitigate that and flatten it out at a minimum? Because we know, I mean, funeral businesses can be hard to grow, but you certainly, I think from if I were to statistics, certainly most of them you'd like to think a funeral home's going to be flat for the most part, but if they're not that, probably the next trend is that they're going down.
Right.
And then if you're so lucky that you're going up, and you're not going up by just adding trade calls, but you're actually adding calls and or growing in that market, well, that's the business that's going to get the most value. Ironically, it's usually the owner that says, well, I'm not ready to sell. And I've always said, usually when you're going to get the most value is when you're not ready to sell, because that means you got a good business and people will recognize it. So,
yeah, that's right.
So risks and rewards.
That makes total sense. I often wonder, what, maybe a funeral home was approached by a, company wanted to buy them, and maybe they even threw out some numbers 5 years ago, and that number's still, noodling back there. And then they come now and they want to sell, and, it's not the same, right? Different market, different valuation. And then all of a sudden that's, got to be like a punch in the gut, because this is probably all about timing,
Well, yeah, I mean, timing is a good piece of it. In the 2000s, as we came out, as I came back into the M&A world, buyers were still fidgety on buying anything, and you didn't have the major players in there. And so, but the sellers that had been presented nice offers in the late 90s were still feeling those numbers. And so, timing as it relates to the financing world, even, what do the rates look like? It's a good rate market right now. And you've got good interest from venture capitalist firms in our space. And so there's more of a discipline in what buyers are buying, but the money's cheap right now, and it's a good profession to be in, industry of sorts to be in compared to some others right now. So I'd have to say what the result is, which is always a question, is, what's the market look like, what the multiples look like, and they're very healthy right now for good businesses. They really are.
You just made me think of a question. So obviously there's a lot of private equity money floating around right now, and they're coming after the funeral business. I don't see it on the funeral home side, because that's not the side I'm on. I see it on the vendor side, and we all know what's going on right now, and some other stuff's about to, become public about it. Do you see the private equity money on the funeral home side?
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. The only problem they have in the funeral space is that it's easier to ask for 50 million to go out and buy businesses than ask for $1 million or $2 million. So they want growth, and they want it fast. And when you run those models for internal rate of returns, it makes sense. I mean, they need to throw that in, build it up, because you're not going to, in a funeral space, you're probably not going to grow your EBITDA in a short period of time, where you get a good return on your money in a short period of time by just trying to find calls. So you're going to buy lots of buildings, lots of funeral businesses, and you need to do it quick. And if you can't, they're not interested. So they are, and so then they need to find the right people that can help them expand and grow exponentially. So, and there's a lot of competition right now for funeral businesses for sale.
Do you see that? Do you see on the vendor side that they're going to continue? The private equity money is going to kind of continue.
I would think so at least in the short term, until they either discover it was the best idea they ever had, or it was the worst idea they ever had. We all live it. Our space is singles and doubles, and it's good. And we those of us that know that, we operate in that space, that framework well, and we succeed in that regard. But if you come in and you're looking to go from 0 to $1 billion or 5, whatever that is, I mean, it can be tough. It's not. I enjoy seeing people do things beyond what you think is possible, because it provides new perspective, right? And so I think it remains to be seen. But it would. I think if that does not go so well in that regard, with the anticipation for growth in the technology and vendor segment of this space, I think it might be difficult, because it's a lot about. I mean, they want to work with you, Welton. They want to work with Ellery. They want to work with Jake. And as much as you like, there's the book, make a service out of or a product out of a service. There's still that personal component within our space, and thank God for it. But it can be difficult when you're trying to grow into like a commodity, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Jake, I have a question for you. So let's say if it's a decent sized firm, typically the owners are still intimately involved. And as a buyer, are they looking, obviously your business will be a little more more higher valuation if the owner is not as involved. You have good processes in place already. But how do you find that fine boundary, as now you have to hire somebody before you sell, or it's like now you're
it's usually, I mean, there's kind of two factors. So even the small markets. So we own a small funeral home, less than 100 calls in Batesville, Indiana. It's a great funeral home. When the manager there will retire, we're going to need a manager there, to replace him, because there's, I'm not thinking of all the staff there, but it's just different than if you bought, a multiple location business that's got multiple managers, and it's the owner's more in the market and not in the day to day.
Right.
I find that crossover is the small markets, and certainly just the smaller businesses. So call it 110 funerals or less, depending on where you are in the U.S. It might be 200 calls if you're in California, West Coast or whatever. But so it might be more revenue driven of 500,000, 800,000, where if somebody's going to come in and buy that, it might be more of an owner operator, or it's a tuck in, if you will, with the next guy, funeral home owner, and that can impact value for sure. Yeah. But the more so, I mean, everybody would love, I don't know. I look at what my father did when he grew his acquisition company, and he embraced the former ownership. And there's more work that's involved in that. It's because you now have. I mean, you've taken one entrepreneur and it was acquired by another entrepreneur, and you try to agree on things. I mean, that can be difficult no matter who you are and what profession. So much less having multiple funeral business owners that you keep involved. But there's one thing that's been interesting for me as I've grown my company is, sometimes we forget that people who retire, they're not necessarily looking for to be having to be involved in everything. They just like to be heard. Like they like to still know that their opinion matters, because it did not too long ago, and now nobody wants to listen to them. So, there's a lot of value in the owners when you use them correctly, and you hope that the owner, when it gets to that point, understands that they've sold their business and now there's a new owner, and then you also hope that the new owner understands that owner brought value and that they can work together. And when they do, it's beautiful. I mean, it's really, that's the way I have it at my funeral home. George Menke, who my father first bought that funeral home from him, and now I did. George's still there, and I embrace him coming there. And he does the parts he likes to do, and he knows where we have to take over, do our parts. And so it's a great marriage. And he gets to still be in his town and hold his head high. I think he does. And so I guess my answer to your comment is the owners are certainly critical in the business. They can be in their own way. And so, if there's a good understanding of what they will do and not do going forward, I think they can be a great asset. So,
Thank you.
All right. So let's say that I'm the funeral home owner. You throw a number out there. I feel like it's good. And now we sign a letter of intent. And now this is the part I never hear anybody talk about. What does due diligence look like for a funeral home to be acquired?
Right, right.
This is where
So
this is where the rubber meets the road, right?
yeah. So now is where you take, a marketing analysis, a market package analysis that maybe you were only given 4 to 6 weeks to really review and limited access, well, no access to the ownership probably. And now you're digging into those more. You're saying, you're trying to get a better understanding of through building inspections and rolling stock, deeper discussions, and really starting to get into also the payroll part of how are we now going to run this. We theorize that this is how it's going to run. Is this really how it's going to work? And so, there's going to be some key people that probably need to speak to, and that can be difficult though, because, you haven't closed yet, they don't own it. And so that again, Welton, to your point on size, the bigger the business is, the better chance you typically have to maybe have some of those discussions, because those key people might even already known what's going on. The smaller the business is, it's ironically, you can get intimate with what's going on because you're talking to the owner who's also running everything, but it's hard to talk to the staff until you get closer to the close, because deals fall apart, and inevitably everybody thinks they're losing their job, and they're not. They're needed at the business. But the due diligence involves building inspections, financial inspections. In that process, you're starting to line out as a buyer how you're going to own the business. Are you going to set up a new entity? What your bank account's going to look like? Much of the due diligence ends up coming in what the bank due diligence is and what the bank needs to do. That's the bank might be the first holdup, not because they intentionally are holding it up, but there's a lot of work they need to do from an underwriting perspective. It's a deeper dive than some of those things would never impact how the success of the funeral business is. It's just the things they need to check off the list. So, and then you got more formal documents, asset purchase agreements. You're taking that term sheet, that letter of intent, and you're breaking it apart into all the more expansive documents, such as consulting agreements, covenants not to compete in our space, asset or stock purchase agreements, bill of sales. There's just a host of things that now become the finer points. As I always say, there's people get really excited. They're under a letter of intent and they feel like it's done. And it might even have been, a struggle to get there, some frustrating points and adversarial comments. But now that we're done, now the LOI is done, they feel good about it. And I always say, well, listen, these things might come up, there's a good chance they can come up again as we go through these agreements, and just know it's part of the process. Don't take it personal, and let's, work ourselves through it, and you'll be happy in the end. So, but due diligence, certainly deeper dive into the initial analysis that you've done of the business.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because this will be enlightening. What are the snags in due diligence? I mean, because obviously, they're going to ask for, board meeting minutes and, just some of that stuff that they probably are not doing. What do you see most commonly as the snag?
You're not going to get much of a review of the board meeting minutes, to be quite honest. Those things are kind of, in fact, I've been to closings where they bring it to the table and you're like, oh yeah, the board meeting minutes. It's just, you just pass over it.
Well, I guess a better question would be, what does the acquirer want during due diligence that the funeral homes generally have a hard time providing?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the deeper access to things. Depending on the size of the business, you're now really starting to ask questions that if you were trying to hide the fact that you were selling, which you should, quite frankly, at some level, or frame it that, hey, we're doing a valuation for a succession plan. That's usually the comment we use, and it's appropriate because it can lead into things like this. But that deeper access where you're having the accountant pull up detail behind expenses that required further review. A lot of it resides in payroll, though. Really does. Like now it's time to really say, okay, you told me this person can do it. I need to know more about this person. I need to know more about how you guys handle these funerals when they come in, that everything is adequately staffed. You tell me that you can run at this percentage of payroll, but I need to be convinced. I believed it through this part of the process because that's all I had access to, and that's my offer. But now I need to make sure my offer still stands, basically, and it usually does. If you've provided the correct amount of information, which is not too much but not too little, and a good, well thought out marketing package, you'll usually, as intrusive as due diligence is, you'll usually end up with a result that your value is still what you thought it was. So, but the things that are difficult are really getting more into the payroll side of things. And then I'd say, as they, usually you're buying the property, so there's the inspections, and then inevitably, because funeral homes have been around so long, that you've got, maybe a boundary issue occurs, or there's a tank that was in the ground that never was a problem for you, but now the buyer, now the bank wants it out of there, and so that might hold things up, environmental things, what have you. So those are some of the snags that can come up. But really, if you're prepared as an owner and you got some help, and because the fact of the matter is you still have your day job, you're still handling families and what have you. So it's a large distraction is the big thing. So how are you going to assign this out or get the help to help you through that thing? So.
Right. And Jake, just curious, how often the offer changes during due diligence?
Very rarely, but it has. I've had transactions where it does, and where it gets to the point where the difference just it kills the deal, or maybe a portion is put in. They try to do an earnout, which can be difficult to track, or they might put it in like a deferred payment where you kind of prove out that the new competitor isn't going to take half your business or whatever. But in general, it stays with what the offer was. It was presented. Where it becomes a problem, the biggest thing that causes problems in offer adjustments is when you didn't fairly represent the numbers to begin with. Like you said, you didn't need you were cutting way too much more than what's really is personal expense, or you're running it so thin in payroll, and it's working, but you're not going to be there anymore. And the first thing everybody's going to do is say, I'm not working here anymore until you get to meet two more funeral directors. And so, that you're being fair about the fact that you're no longer going to be there. And while you're comfortable with working 80 hours a week, others should expect to maybe work 50, 40 or 50. I mean, you just have to be reasonable to expectations. And usually it's just that result in upfront analysis to make sure that you're fairly looking at your own financials before you go out and let others look at them,
Awesome. Well, let's jump into the last section here, which is what are some things owners can do today to try to get themselves set up for a sale later, even if they don't want to sell, right? What should they be doing in case that ever happens?
Yep. So there's some obvious things to me that they need to do, and they should be starting to do it now if they're not already doing it. They should have good accounting, good financial statements. So when somebody asks for them, it's very easy to follow and it's not a mess from one year to the next. Because if a buyer can't develop a quick and easy trend on expense management and revenues, that's one tick in that risk column, versus the opportunity. They absolutely should be monitoring their customer results, both on the survey metrics, how they're posting online to your comment, Welton, and then also their sales average. I do a presentation to show the variance between average sales between two funeral directors. I think the spread is like $600, and it ends up resulting in an enterprise value loss of about $130,000 when you do it to the bottom line times the multiple. And wow. So what's interesting, because it's all trend driven, if you hadn't done any of that and you want to sell today, well, it's going to, you hadn't done all that, but maybe you started 6 months ago, you're probably not going to get much value benefit out of it, although that was good of you to do. It was a good practice. If you started it 3 years ago and now it's time to look at what the value is, I have cases where you're talking about adding enterprise value of $500,000 plus, to $1 million, just by doing things that we all know we should be doing, training our staff, meeting with them, talking about their presentations, what's their average sale look like, why is Joe's better than Jane's, what can we do to make that closer, and certainly how do we merchandise our rooms, and how do we present our services, and how are we trying to get every case that comes in that funeral home or funeral business or cemetery, what have you, because each of those translates to a value. As they say, I think every 10,000, if you look at my presentations on average sale, I mean, I think $100 in average sale increase on a 500 call firm. If you add that to the bottom line, you've got, what is that? 50, about $300,000 in additional value. But if your average sale dropped $100 on your 500 call firm, then that was a decline of $300,000 in value. The good news is you'll never know it because you're going to ask me for the value that one day, and you already lost $100. So I'm just going to tell you what the value is, and you never knew what it was with 300,000 more. So start working on that stuff now, really.
You're coming to that number because you're adding $50,000 value plus 6
plus
times
a multiple. I just took an average of 6 times multiple just for example purposes. But yeah, and it's very real.
Yeah. And
so if you've seen, if you've got, if you see that your average has gone from 5,000, now it's 4,800 or 40, whatever the number is, and it's clearly from a trend standpoint, it's going to be hard to convince somebody to keep it at 5,000. And you are a 500 call firm, you have absolutely lost at least 300,000 in value to your firm on a trend analysis. And we don't think of it that way, right? I mean, that's not how you think of things, but it's real when it gets time.
I saw you do a presentation out in California one time, and you talked about that. And I remember looking around that room, and people's eyes got really big because what seems insignificant, right, becomes very significant when it comes time to sell. So yeah, absolutely.
That's a lot of compounding that goes on there, and the result is, like I say, the good news is you'll never really know what that result is because unless you're really proactive in doing evaluation on an annual basis, which is not a bad thing to do. The fact is you're going to get it. You end up getting it when it's time to sell, and it is what it is, as they say, right?
Yeah. Well, I think if I was the funeral home owner listening to this, I think the lesson for me would just be to be intentional, to really look at your numbers and know where you're at, so that it's not a surprise, and I think the lesson also too, and I'm sure there's a lot of horror stories here, would be, don't wait until someone approaches you to, try to get the stuff put together, because then you're going to be doing it, out of necessity, right? And as opposed to doing it proactively.
Right. I always say, I have a presentation that say denial is not a river in Egypt, as they say. And
Right.
so, you're, don't be in denial on this stuff that it can't happen to you. I mean, always be tracking the redundancy and your staff and their quality and helping build their quality or finding quality people, because that translates into value as well. But certainly those average sales and how those people are presenting, and just the very nature of just being organized and intentional within your organization. The tools are out there, to monitor your sales average regularly within most point of sale systems. You can do deeper dives with more consulting on that, but, the tools are out there. And so the question is, what is your dashboard that you use at your business to track that stuff? Maybe it's quarterly, maybe to me, it's weekly. But, what are the things you look at and so you can kind of see things that are trending one way or the other and do something about it before it's too late.
My dad, this reminds me, he used to tell me that, if you looked inside of a car, you could tell how well a person maintained the engine, right?
Right.
There's a correlation between that. And I think about if I was the acquirer and I wanted to approach you, and, if I asked for your financials and it's an apocalyptic event, you know what I mean? Like, I'm going to know that this whole thing is in disarray. But if you say, okay, give me 10 minutes, right, and I'll run these reports and hand them to you, and the numbers without even looking at them, then I'm going to think that there's a lot better chance that this thing is going to be successful. So
it's those mental check marks, right? How easy was it to get the financials? How the financials look? What is their payroll? It's the financial and non-financial. We call it our value matrix, but looking inside, but also the outside of the business, and what kind of attentions they're paying to things. There's businesses that out there still that, they might not have a point of sale system, or their use of it is very minimal, and, getting reports out of it is, to your point, takes too long. And that while you're, as a buyer, you're eager, you want to buy, and you convince yourself of anything, it starts wearing on you. You start saying, okay, there's something going on here, right?
Yeah. And the dashboard can't be your check register.
Right. Or your check register can't be your monitor. I mean, I have a lot that say, well, I've got enough in the bank, so I'm fine. And so, really, what is that? And it even comes down to analysis we've done recently on firms where receivables were high. So if a buyer's going to go in there and now they're going to do what we should be doing in receivables, and maybe it's more of a 15-day versus 60. Are the clients all going to be like, "Whoa, I'm not going there anymore. They don't give you a deal anymore. They ask for the money." So, it's not about just the average and how well we're treating the families, but if we're not collecting it, it mattered to families, but it's not mattering to us anymore as business owners. So,
that's right. Doesn't matter what your revenue is if you can't collect it. So, Well, listen, Jake, you've been super gracious, and Welton and I certainly appreciate it. I know the audience definitely does. I could talk about hours and hours about this stuff. I love it. And I think it's just important that the funeral home owners just at least think about it, be intentional about it. Because ultimately it's going to create more value for your funeral home if you are intentional, whether you want to sell it or not. I think at the end of the day, that's going to be doing that. So, Jake, again, most people know you, but how can people reach out to you if they want to get a hold of you? I'm sure you accept LinkedIn requests and all that other stuff.
Email, sure. You got to find me on LinkedIn, but you've got the email address, jjohnson@johnsonconsulting.com. Certainly our main phone number there as well, 480-556-8500. But the one thing that you guys do it as well is in this space is, we're all kind of in it together, especially right now, and just helping each other out. And I've always found, as you're doing, even with this podcast, that, you give back, and when people are ready, they think of you. So, if it's just general questions, whatever, people should reach out and ask. I'm not going to charge them for that kind of stuff. I mean, when they're ready, they're ready, but in the meantime, we're all trying to help each other out. So,
yeah, that's exactly how we feel. That's why we started this podcast, was to be able to, teach the funeral home owners stuff that, they may not be able to learn elsewhere or don't even think about, and that's why we want to kind of go down that path. But again, Jake, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We certainly appreciate it. So I guess we'll talk to everybody next week. Thanks, Welton.
Thank you. See ya.